He hadn't touched a weapon in 9 years. 9 years of grease-stained hands, school lunches packed at 5 in the morning, and a quiet life built deliberately out of the wreckage of everything he used to be. 9 years of making himself small enough that the past couldn't find him. It found him anyway. The first bullet came through the window of Bellwether Diner on a Tuesday afternoon, and before the glass finished falling, Ethan Maddox was already moving. Not away from the danger, but straight through it. Because some things don't unlearn themselves. Some things just wait. If this story already has you gripping your seat, you're exactly where we want you. Hit that subscribe button and drop your city or country in the comments below. We want to see how far this story travels. Like the video, stay until the end and don't miss what's coming next, because this one goes places you won't expect. The Tuesday lunch rush at Bellwether Diner ran the same way it always did. Loud, a little chaotic, and smelling like burnt coffee and bacon grease that had soaked into the walls sometime around 1987 and never left. The place sat on the corner of Millbrook and 4th in Greyhaven, a mid-sized town that prided itself on being exactly the kind of place nothing interesting ever happened. The booths were red vinyl patched with electrical tape. The menus were laminated and sticky. The pie was legitimately good, which was the only reason people kept coming back. Ethan Maddox sat in the booth closest to the back wall, left side facing the door. He always sat facing the door. His daughter Sophie had asked him once why he did that when she was 8, and he told her it was because he liked watching people come in. She'd accepted that the way kids accept things that don't quite add up, but don't feel worth arguing about. She was 13 now. She'd stopped accepting his non-answers. He was working through a club sandwich he didn't particularly want because he'd skipped breakfast and Sophie had texted him 3 times reminding him that coffee wasn't a meal. The sandwich was mostly for her benefit, even though she wasn't there to see it. That was the thing about raising a kid alone. They got inside your head and rearranged the furniture, and you stopped making bad decisions not because you wanted to, but because you could hear them disapproving from across town. His phone sat face up on the table beside a half-empty mug. The screen showed a text thread from his shop mechanic, Danny Reyes, about a carburetor rebuild on a '68 Mustang that was taking longer than expected. Ethan had replied with a parts list and a question about timing, and now he was waiting and eating and watching the lunch crowd do what lunch crowds did. Talk too loud, eat too fast, leave bad tips. He almost didn't notice her. That wasn't entirely true. He noticed her the moment she walked in, the way he noticed most things in a room, cataloged her without thinking about it, the way his brain had been trained to do and then had never entirely stopped. Woman, early 30s, dressed for somewhere more expensive than Bellwether. Dark blazer, good shoes, the kind of posture that came from years of presenting in front of people who were always looking for weakness. She was attractive in a tired way, like someone who had learned to put themselves together carefully and was running low on the energy required to keep doing it. What he clocked first wasn't her appearance. It was the way she moved through the room. She checked the exits before she picked a seat. Not obviously. She disguised it as glancing around for a table, but Ethan recognized the motion because he'd made it himself 10,000 times. She chose a booth in the middle of the diner, which was the wrong choice if you wanted visibility. But she compensated by angling her body sideways so she could see the front door without turning her head. She set her bag on the seat beside her instead of on the floor. Accessible. She ordered from the server without making extended eye contact, kept her voice low, and positioned her phone screen down on the table but within reach. None of that was how a regular person at lunch behaved. Ethan looked back at his sandwich and thought, not my problem. He was 37 years old. He owned a shop on the east side of town called Maddox Auto, which had 12 bays and a waiting list that ran 3 weeks out, because he was good at what he did, and because he was one of the few shops in Greyhaven that didn't try to upsell people on repairs they didn't need. He coached Sophie's soccer team on weekends, when scheduling allowed. He had a small house with a leaky gutter he kept meaning to fix, and a garden in the back that grew tomatoes in summer and nothing in winter. And he had a life that was small and controlled and deliberately uncomplicated. And that was exactly what he wanted. He was not in the business of noticing women who checked exits. He ate his sandwich. She'd been there about 15 minutes when the black SUV pulled up outside. Ethan didn't see it at first. He was looking at his phone. Then something shifted in the ambient noise of the diner. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of one. The woman in the blazer had gone very still in a way that wasn't natural. She was staring at something past the window, and whatever she was looking at had drained the color from her face. Ethan looked up. The SUV was parked at the curb, engine running, tinted windows. The rear passenger window was cracked about 3 inches, not enough to see inside, just enough for something to fit through. He was out of his seat before the conscious thought formed. "Get down!" The window exploded inward. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space, a flat, percussive crack that knocked every other sound out of the room and replaced it with screaming. Glass sprayed across the nearest tables. A woman near the window was already falling sideways out of her chair, her arm up instinctively, and a man near her knocked his coffee across the table, scrambling backward. The second shot came while people were still processing the first. Ethan was already moving through the diner, not toward the exit, toward her. Cutting between tables, his body low and angled, years of muscle memory running his legs while his brain was still catching up. He hit the booth and got his arm around her and drove her down below the table in a single motion that left no room for her to argue or resist. She made a sound, half gasp, half grunt, and grabbed his arm instinctively. "Stay flat," he said. "Don't move." "There are people. I see them. Stay flat." He came up just enough to scan the room. The diner was in the first seconds of real panic, which were always the most dangerous. People standing when they should be down, moving when they should be still, the instinct to flee clashing with the paralysis of shock. The front windows were both blown out. He counted at least 3 people on the floor, one of them bleeding from a gash across her forearm that looked like glass and not a bullet, which was better than the alternative. The shooting had stopped. That was almost worse. Whoever was outside had paused, which meant they were either repositioning, reloading, or waiting for something. Ethan did a fast inventory. He had no weapon. He had a belt, a heavy mug, a fork, and 9 years of the kind of training that didn't have a practical application in civilian life, unless something went catastrophically wrong. He also had an unobstructed sightline to the side exit, a hallway leading past the bathrooms and out to the alley on the west side of the building. He looked at the woman. She was pressed flat against the vinyl bench, and she was frightened, but she wasn't falling apart. Her jaw was set. Her breathing was fast and shallow but controlled. She was thinking. "What's your name?" he said. She looked at him like the question was insane. Given the context, that was fair. "Your name," he said again. "Tell me." "Liana." A beat. "Liana Monroe." "Ethan, can you move?" "Yes." "There's a side exit behind me, hallway past the bathrooms, 30 feet. When I tell you to move, you move low, and you stay behind me, and you do not stop for any reason. You understand?" "Who are you?" "Someone trying to get you out." "Do you understand?" She looked at him for a fraction of a second, really looked at him, the kind of look that was trying to read whether the alternative to trusting a stranger was better or worse than the stranger himself. "Yes," she said. "I understand." "Okay." He looked back at the room. A young server, 19, maybe 20, was crouched behind the counter crying, her hand pressed to a cut on her forehead. An older man in a booth near the back had pulled a woman down with him and was holding her against the floor, his face white but his hand steady. 3 other people were still upright, frozen, too shocked to move. Ethan made a decision he wasn't sure he had the right to make, but made it anyway. "Hey!" His voice came out flat and carrying. Not a shout, but a voice with weight in it, the kind that got trained in and then never left. The frozen people looked at him. "Get on the floor. Now. Crawl toward the back. Stay below the windows." They moved. Something in how he said it left no room for the question of whether he was someone worth listening to. He turned back to Liana. "Now." They made it to the side hallway before the shooting started again. The second volley was different, automatic, coming from multiple directions, too coordinated to be random. Whoever was outside had reorganized. Ethan moved them past the bathrooms and to the side door, pushed it open 2 inches, and checked the alley. Clear. He got Liana out and put her back against the brick wall, putting himself between her and the street. "My car is on Millbrook," she said, already pulling her phone. "Don't." He took her wrist, not hard, but firmly. "If they tracked you to the diner, they know your car." She stared at him. How do you know they tracked me? Because the SUV didn't drive by. It parked. That's not opportunistic, that's planned. He looked down the alley. Who knows you were coming here? Nobody. I was... She stopped. Something moved behind her eyes. I changed my route this morning. I always take Riverside, but I changed it. Why? Because I thought someone might be watching. Ethan looked at her. How long have you known someone was watching? She didn't answer immediately, which was an answer in itself. Long enough, she said quietly. Long enough that I should have been smarter about this. From inside the diner, through the wall, he could still hear chaos, screaming, the crash of something breaking. His stomach turned over. He wanted to go back in. He knew what he needed to do instead. There's a fire station 3 blocks north, he said. They'll have a landline and they'll lock down the block. Can you run? Yes. Then we run. They went north along the alley, and Ethan kept his eyes moving. Corners, windows, the gap between the dumpsters. And the thing he had kept buried for 9 years was fully awake now, sharp and clear and humming, and he hated that it felt like coming home. So, they were half a block from the fire station when the vehicles appeared. Not one, not two. 12 black SUVs coming from both ends of the block and down the cross street, moving in a formation that was practiced and deliberate. They fanned out and stopped, engines running, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the lead vehicle's door opened. The man who stepped out was in his 60s, heavy-set, wearing a dark coat that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly overhead. He had the kind of face that had once been handsome and had aged into something harder and more complicated. Deep lines around the eyes, gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been set permanently against softness. He walked toward them without hurrying, like a man who was accustomed to situations resolving themselves around him. Beside Ethan, Liana went absolutely still. Not the stillness of fear, the stillness of recognition. Liana. The man's voice was deep and unhurried. He stopped 10 feet away. I've been looking for you. The silence stretched. Ethan stayed where he was, slightly in front of her, not reaching for anything he didn't have. You need to step aside, the man said, addressing him directly for the first time. Not unkindly, almost with a kind of tired patience, the way you'd talk to someone who'd stumbled into something they didn't understand. This is a family matter. That's not something you need to know right now. Ethan glanced sideways. Liana's face had gone completely controlled, the practiced blankness of someone who'd learned not to show anything to this particular person. He's my father, she said. Her voice was flat. His name is Silas Vane. The name meant nothing to Ethan in the moment. It would mean a great deal more very soon. I'm not going with you, Liana said. She wasn't talking to Ethan anymore. She was talking to the man in the dark coat. I'm not going anywhere with you. You were almost killed, Silas said. There was something that might have been real emotion underneath the control. Someone inside my organization ordered this. Someone I trusted. A pause. I have been trying to reach you for 3 days. You could have called. You blocked my number. A moment of almost absurd silence, given the 12 vehicles and the gunshots still echoing somewhere behind them. Then you understand why, Liana said. Silas looked at her, and then he looked at Ethan. A long, careful assessment, the kind of look that was used to reading people accurately and quickly. You pulled her out of that diner, he said. It wasn't a question. I was nearby. A mechanic was nearby. The pause was deliberate. You moved like you were something else once. Ethan said nothing. Silas nodded slowly, like that confirmed something. You should walk away from this, he said. Not threatening, almost genuinely advisable. What happened in there will bring attention. The wrong kind. My daughter has enemies I'm still identifying, and they won't care who gets in the way. I'm already in the way, Ethan said. Another pause. Then I hope you know what that means, Silas said quietly. He turned and walked back to his vehicle. Around them, the 12 SUVs sat idling. Liana let out a long, careful breath beside him, the first indication she'd given of what the last few minutes had cost her. I'm sorry, she said. Not the reflexive kind, the kind that comes from somewhere real. I didn't mean for any of this to touch you. Ethan looked at the vehicles. Then at the diner 3 blocks south, where sirens were finally starting in the distance. How long have you been running from him? He asked. From him? She shook her head. A long time. From what's inside his organization? About 4 months, since I found out what some of them are actually doing. He thought about the way she'd moved through the diner, the exits, the angles, the bag kept within reach. 4 months is a long time to run alone, he said. Yes, she said. It is. The sirens were getting closer. Around them, the black SUVs were beginning to pull away, one by one, until only the lead vehicle remained, until it too moved off down the cross street and disappeared. Ethan stood in the middle of the road in Grey Haven, a town where nothing interesting ever happened, holding a sandwich he'd left on the table and a life he'd spent 9 years making deliberately small. He was already calculating distances, entry points, the things that would need to happen in sequence and in what order, if he was going to make sure the woman next to him made it through whatever was coming. He hadn't signed up for this. He hadn't asked for it. But some things don't ask permission. They just start. And you're either moving or you're not. And Ethan Maddox had never been particularly good at standing still when someone needed him. He just wished he was better at pretending he had a choice about it. The Grey Haven Police Department smelled like burnt coffee and old paperwork, which Ethan supposed was universal. He'd been in enough precincts over the years, before, during, after, to know that no matter where you were, they all had that same quality of exhausted bureaucracy baked into the walls. He sat in a plastic chair in the hallway outside interview room B and answered questions for 2 hours and change, and he was careful about every word. Yes, he'd been eating lunch at Bellwether. Yes, he'd helped people get down when the shooting started. No, he didn't know the woman he'd assisted out the side exit. Just a person nearby who needed help. Yes, he had some first aid training from years back. The detective, a heavy-set man named Briggs who looked like he hadn't slept since the previous administration, kept circling back to the moment the vehicles appeared. 12 SUVs, Briggs kept saying, like the number itself was the problem. 12 vehicles, coordinated, and a man who stepped out to speak with the woman. You get a name? Briggs asked for the 3rd time. He didn't introduce himself, Ethan said for the 3rd time. Briggs looked at him the way cops look at people they're pretty sure are lying but can't prove it. And the woman. She said her name was Liana. I didn't get a last name. She give you a number? Any way to reach her? We were a little busy. Briggs tapped his pen against the table. Right. And you said you're a mechanic. I own a shop on East Millbrook, Maddox Auto. And the tactical way you moved people in that diner, I grew up watching action movies, Ethan said. And I used to do some hiking. You learn to stay calm in bad situations. Another long look, then Briggs closed his notebook. We're going to want you available for follow-up. I'm not going anywhere, Ethan said. And that part, at least, was completely true. Sophie was at the shop when he got there, sitting on the waiting room bench with her backpack and her phone, wearing the expression she'd inherited from her mother. Not angry exactly, more like deeply unimpressed with circumstances she'd been placed in without her consent. You were on the news, she said. I know. They said there was a shooting at the diner. She stood up. You went to the diner today. I did. And you were going to call me when exactly? He crossed the waiting room and pulled her into a hug that she resisted for about half a second before she let him, because she was 13 and angry, but she was also still his kid, and she'd been scared. He could feel it in how she held on. I was going to call you after I talked to the police, he said into the top of her head. I didn't want you to worry before I could explain. I was already worried. She pulled back and looked at him with those dark eyes that always made him feel like she was older than him. Are you okay? I'm fine. Nobody hurt me. That's not the same as okay. He looked at her. No, he agreed. It's not, but I'm fine. I promise. She studied his face the way she always did when she was deciding whether to believe him, then seemed to accept it and sat back down. Danny appeared in the doorway from the bay, late 20s, grease on his forearms, the permanently skeptical expression of a man who'd worked for Ethan long enough to know when something was being left out. You good? Danny said. I'm good. The Mustang's done, by the way. Timing's set. She runs clean. Good. Write it up and call Mr. Ferreira. Danny nodded, but he didn't leave. He stood in the doorway with the particular stillness of someone deciding whether to say the thing they'd been sitting on. There was a guy here, he said finally. About an hour ago. Said he was from the county assessor's office. Asked some questions about the property. Ethan looked at him. What kind of questions? How long we'd been operating, whether you owned or leased, whether you had any outstanding liens. A pause. I told him we were fully current on everything, and he should check the county records. He said he would. Danny paused again. He was wearing a watch worth more than my car, Ethan. That's not a county assessor. The quiet stretched for a moment. Thanks for telling me, Ethan said. You want to talk about what's actually going on? Not yet. Danny considered this, then nodded. All right, I'll lock up the bay. After he left, Sophie looked up from her phone. Who was the man at our shop? I don't know yet. But you think you know why he came. He sat down next to her on the bench. The vinyl cracked under his weight. Outside, a car pulled past on the street, and he tracked it automatically. Angle, speed, whether it slowed, and hated himself a little for it. There was a woman at the diner, he said. She was in trouble. I helped her. Obviously, Sophie said it matter-of-factly, like it wasn't even a question. Then, softer. What kind of trouble? The kind that doesn't stay in one place. He looked at his hands. There was still a thin line of glass dust in the creases of his right palm from the diner window. He'd washed his hands twice and missed it. I want you to stay at Aunt Carla's tonight. Sophie went still. She knew what that meant. Not the details, but the shape of it. They'd talked about it once when she was 11 and had found a locked box under his bed that he'd moved to a storage unit after she'd asked about it. He'd told her then that there were parts of his life before Grey Haven that he'd left behind for good reasons, and that if those reasons ever came close, he would tell her, and she would need to trust him. She'd been angry about it then. She was quieter about it now. Okay, she said. One word. She didn't ask him to explain. He looked at her. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, just be careful. She stood up and shouldered her backpack. Then she stopped. Was she okay? The woman you helped? He thought about Liana Monroe standing in the middle of a Grey Haven street with 12 black vehicles pulling away around her jaw set, her eyes doing the math on a situation that had no clean answers. She's standing, he said. That counts for something. Sophie nodded once, like that was enough, and went to call her aunt. Liana Monroe had not gone to a hotel under her own name. She wasn't careless enough for that, and whatever else the day had done to her, it hadn't broken her judgment. Ethan found the message on his cell. A number he didn't recognize, 4 words, need to talk, please. He'd gotten it 40 minutes after leaving the police station. He'd sat with it for another 30 before he responded. She was using a room at the Kerrigan Motor Lodge on Route 9, paid in cash under a name that wasn't hers. 3rd floor corner unit with a sightline to the parking lot. He noted that when she opened the door, the way she'd positioned herself to see who was coming from 50 yards out, old habits from someone who'd been running long enough to develop them. She looked worse than she had at the diner. The composure was still there, but underneath it she was exhausted in the specific way of someone who hadn't genuinely slept in days. There was a laptop open on the small desk, documents spread around it, a takeout container of food that looked like it had been there long enough to stop being appealing. Thank you for coming, she said. Didn't say I was staying. He stepped inside and let the door close behind him. But you deserve a conversation. She gestured at the desk chair. He took it. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap. Not relaxed, just contained. My father didn't arrange the shooting, she said, getting to it directly. I didn't think he did. A man who wanted you dead doesn't fly convoy to pull you out of a crime scene. Something flickered across her face. You read people. When I have to. He looked at the documents on the desk without touching them. You want to tell me what's actually happening? Not the version you'd give a reporter. The real one. She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across and turned the laptop toward him. The screen showed a corporate org chart, the the kind with 100 nodes that meant nothing to anyone who didn't already understand the underlying structure. But in the upper right quadrant, she'd circled two names. One of them was Silas Vane. The other was a name Ethan didn't recognize, Preston Crow. My father built his organization 20 years ago, Liana said. It was legitimate on the surface, real estate, logistics, some private security contracts. Underneath it, there were things he was involved in that I didn't know about until I was older. Things that... She stopped, started again. I left when I was 23. I moved, built my own company from scratch, kept my distance. I thought if I built a wall high enough, the past would stay on the other side of it. It doesn't work that way. No. She looked at her hands. 4 months ago, one of my father's former accountants reached out to me. He'd kept records, not to use against my father, just to protect himself, the way people in that world do. He said something was wrong inside the organization. Money moving in patterns that didn't make sense. Contracts being manipulated. He thought someone was embezzling, maybe more than that. She paused. 2 weeks later, he was in a car accident. He's been in a coma since. The room was very quiet. Preston Crow, Ethan said. He's been with my father since the beginning, 20 years, trusted completely. Her voice had gone careful, the way people talk about something they've had time to study and still can't fully process. What the accountant's records show, what I've been able to piece together, is that Preston has been systematically draining funds from the organization and laundering them through a series of shell companies. Not for years, for months. He's been liquidating assets, converting everything he can into untraceable capital. He's building an exit, or building leverage. She reached for a folder, opened it, slid a printed page across to him. It was a list of names, some with titles, some without. These are officials, local, state level, some federal. People Preston has been paying, not through the organization's existing relationships, which were already complicated enough. New payments, recent ones. He's been building his own network inside the machine, independent of my father's influence. Ethan looked at the list. He recognized two of the names, not personally, but the positions. One was a county prosecutor. Another was a man who sat on a federal oversight board for organized crime investigations. If he controls the investigators, Ethan said slowly, he controls what gets investigated. And what doesn't. She closed the folder. I think Preston is planning to dismantle my father's organization from the inside, take everything worth taking, and use his network of officials to make sure nobody can hold him accountable for any of it. And I think he's planning to eliminate anyone who could prove what he's done. She met his eyes. Including my father, including me. How much does your father know? I don't know. I haven't spoken to him in 7 years. A pause. That's not strictly true. He's tried to reach me. I ignored it. She looked at the window, at the parking lot beyond. I thought his problems were his problems. I thought I'd gotten far enough away. And the accountant who reached out to you, did he contact anyone else? Give you the only copies of his records? He sent me digital files and a physical backup. I've kept them separate. She looked back at him. That's what they're looking for. Not me specifically. The records. I just happened to be the person holding them. Ethan sat back in the chair. Outside in the parking lot, a car pulled in and parked, and he tracked it until the driver got out. A man in his 40s, hotel key card already in hand, not paying attention to anything around him. Nobody. You said you built your own company, he said. What do you run? A logistics consulting firm, Monroe Solutions, 40 employees, offices in 3 states. Something crossed her face, a brief, complicated look that was equal parts pride and pain. I built it with nothing. I didn't take a cent from my father. I didn't use his name or his contacts. I wanted... She stopped again. I wanted to prove that I was something other than what I came from. And are you? She looked at him directly. It was the kind of question that could have landed badly, but she took it straight. Most days, she said. Most days I think I am. He nodded. He understood that answer in a way that would have taken too long to explain. The shooting today was meant to look random, he said. Street violence, wrong place, wrong time, CEO caught in crossfire. Clean. Yes. Nothing traceable back to Preston. But it failed, which means he'll adjust. Yes. And your father's convoy showing up means someone inside the organization tipped Silas off, which means Preston doesn't have complete control yet. She exhaled slowly. But he's close. Ethan was quiet for a moment, working through the geometry of it. The accountant's records were the key, the kind of documented evidence that, in the right hands and through the right channels, could dismantle what Preston had built regardless of who he'd bought. The question was which hands and which channels were still clean. You have the record secured, Mosquise? He asked. Yes. Both copies in separate locations? Yes. Does anyone else know where? She shook her head, then hesitated. My assistant knows I was keeping documents related to the firm's legal affairs in an off-site location. Not what they were. Not where exactly. That's enough for someone to pull on. He stood up. Don't contact your assistant from your current phone. Don't contact anyone from a number that's been used in the last 48 hours. She looked at him. You're staying involved in this. It wasn't quite a question. He wasn't sure it was a welcome observation either. There was something careful in the way she said it, like she'd spent long enough handling things alone that another person's involvement was almost harder to accept than the problem itself. You need someone who knows how to move inside this kind of situation without leaving tracks, he said, and who doesn't have a stake in either side of your family's business. And what do you get out of it? He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. They sent someone to my shop today. I don't know yet if it was Preston's people or your father's, but either way, they already know where I work, which means they already know where I live. He looked at her levelly. I was already in this the moment I walked across that diner. I'd rather be in it on my own terms. She was quiet for a moment. Then, your daughter. He stilled slightly. You mentioned her when you were talking to the detective. The wall between the rooms is thin. She met his eyes, and her voice was different now. Not careful, just direct. She's the reason you left whatever you were before, isn't she? It wasn't phrased as a question, so he didn't answer it like one. She's the reason for most things, he said. That cuts both ways. Liana nodded. She seemed to understand what that meant without him having to expand on it. He got to the door and stopped. Something had been sitting at the edge of his thinking since the police station, a detail he'd kept setting aside to look at later. The first shot, he said, turning back. It came through the window and hit a table 2 booths away from where you were sitting, not particularly close. I noticed that. A professional shooter, a planned hit, doesn't miss that wide on the first shot unless something disrupted their aim. Wind, unexpected movement, bad angle. He looked at her. Or they wanted the first shot to miss. She frowned. Why would... To get you moving. A stationary target is a predictable target. A panicked target runs for the door. He let that land. The second shot came from a different angle, closer to where the exit was. The color shifted slightly in her face. They weren't trying to kill me at the table. I don't think so. I think they were trying to move you to a specific position, somewhere easier to control. He paused. Which means they had eyes inside, or a very accurate read on how someone in your situation would react. Liana sat very still. The implications of that were working their way through her expression. The realization that the threat wasn't just external, wasn't just a shooter in a parked car, but something that had read her well enough to predict her behavior. I need to think about that, she said quietly. Yeah, Ethan said. Me too. He didn't go home that night. He drove past it, slow, one pass, and counted 2 vehicles parked on the street that hadn't been there in the morning. One was a sedan with a cracked tail light and a rental agency sticker barely visible on the bumper. The other was a gray pickup with a commercial plate that didn't match any of the businesses in the immediate area. 2. Meaning they were being careful, not obvious, not trying to intimidate, trying to observe. He kept driving. He ended up at the shop, let himself in through the side door, and sat in the dark office with the monitor off and the blinds turned. He was not a man who scared easily. He had no physiological room for it after the places he'd been. But the sensation moving through him now was something adjacent to fear and something adjacent to anger. And the part that disturbed him wasn't those feelings themselves, but how familiar they were, like a set of muscles that had just been asked to work again after years of deliberate disuse. He got out his phone and navigated to a contact he hadn't used in a very long time. The number still worked. He tested it every year, the way you test a smoke alarm, hoping the day never comes when you need it. It rang 3 times. Maddox. The voice on the other end was even and unhurried, the voice of a man who'd spent his career treating surprises as administrative inconveniences. It's been a while. Garrett. Ethan kept his own voice low. I need information. Off the books. A pause. Not surprise. Garrett didn't do surprise. Calculation. What kind? A name. Preston Crow. Corporate connections, financial activity, any federal flags in the last 6 months. That's not a small ask. I know. Give me until morning. Another pause. You back in something? Something found me. Garrett made a sound that wasn't quite a sigh. More the particular exhalation of a man who'd spent decades watching people try to leave the world they'd trained for and never entirely make it. Yeah, he said. That's how it usually goes. Morning, Maddox. The call ended. Ethan set the phone face down on the desk and sat in the dark office of his auto shop, in the town he'd chosen specifically because it was quiet. And he thought about his daughter sleeping at her aunt's house 3 miles away, and about a woman in a third-floor motel room with documents that could get her killed, and about a man named Preston Crow who had looked at other people's lives and decided they were negotiable. He thought about a question Sophie had asked him once when she was 10, watching a movie where the hero decided to come out of retirement to save someone. Why do people who leave always end up going back? He told her it was because the movies needed a story. She'd given him the look that meant she knew he was deflecting. He hadn't had a better answer then. He still didn't. But sitting in the dark with the weight of it pressing down on him, he thought that maybe the honest answer was simpler and less comfortable than any story he could tell her. Some people leave a life behind because they want to. Some people leave because they need to, because they've seen what the alternative costs and they're not willing to keep paying it. But leaving didn't change what you were made of. It just changed where you were standing. And sometimes where you were standing was right in the middle of something that needed handling, and the only real question was whether you were going to pretend otherwise until it was too late. He wasn't any good at pretending. He tried it for 9 years, and it had almost worked, and now there were 2 cars parked outside his house, and a woman in a motel room who'd been running alone long enough that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone on her side, and his daughter was 3 miles away, safe for now, sleeping with her phone on the nightstand because she was 13 and scared and too proud to say so. He pulled out the desk drawer and took out a notepad, started writing names, connections, the sequence of what he knew and what he needed to know, the shape of what Preston Crow was building, and what it would take to pull it apart. It took him about an hour. By the time he finished, the notepad had 4 pages of tight, careful handwriting, and his coffee had gone cold, and outside the first gray light was starting at the edge of the sky. He looked at what he'd written. Then he put the notepad in his jacket pocket, locked the office, and went to find somewhere he could wash his face and start the day. There was a lot of work to do. Garrett came through by 7:15 in the morning, which was faster than Ethan expected, and thorough enough to be uncomfortable. Preston Crow, 61 years old, registered address in Ashford County, 3 corporate entities attached to his name through layers of LLC filings that would take a tax attorney the better part of a month to fully untangle. On the surface, clean. Not even clean in an obvious, overcorrected way. Just the ordinary, unremarkable financial profile of a senior partner in a legitimate consulting firm who'd made reasonable money over a long career and invested it reasonably well. The kind of profile that was designed to be looked at and put down without a second thought. Underneath it, Garrett had found the edges of something else. 3 shell companies incorporated in the last 8 months. A pattern of wire transfers cycling through accounts in jurisdictions that weren't hostile enough to draw immediate federal attention, but weren't transparent enough to be easily audited. And 1 flag, a single notation in a federal organized crime task force database. Not an investigation, just an observation. Preston Crow's name appeared in the contact records of 2 officials already under separate review for financial misconduct. It wasn't evidence. It was the shape of evidence, the outline, where evidence would eventually be if someone followed it long enough and didn't get stopped first. Ethan read the file twice in the front seat of his truck, parked behind a laundromat 3 blocks from the motel. Then he drove to the motel and knocked on Liana's door. She answered in the same clothes as the night before. The takeout container was gone. The documents on the desk had been reorganized into 3 distinct stacks. There was a legal pad covered in her handwriting propped against the laptop. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Neither did you." She stepped back to let him in. "What did you find?" He spread Garrett's information on the desk beside her documents and walked her through it. She listened without interrupting, which he was beginning to understand was characteristic. She waited until she had the full picture before she responded, a discipline that probably served her well in boardrooms and served her even better now. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up one of her own document stacks and pulled a page from the middle of it, a transfer record, dates, and account numbers annotated in her handwriting. "The accountant's records show the source accounts," she said. "What you have shows where the money went after the 3rd transfer point. They connect." She set both pages side by side. "Together, this is enough to open a federal investigation. If we can get it to someone who hasn't been bought." "Yes." She looked at the 2 pages. "That's the problem I've been sitting with for 4 months. Ethan understood. The list she'd shown him the night before, the officials in Preston's network, was the answer to why she hadn't simply walked into a federal building and handed the records over. When you didn't know which rooms were clean, the safest move was to not walk into any of them until you were certain. The problem was that certainty took time, and Preston wasn't giving them time. "Garrett can get this to someone," Ethan said. "He's worked federal organized crime for 20 years. He knows who's reachable." "Can you trust him?" "Enough for this." He paused. "He has his own reasons to want a network of compromised officials cleaned up. It affects his work. And how long would it take to establish a contact and build a secure channel?" "Days, maybe a week." She was quiet again, doing the calculation he was also doing. Preston had already moved once, the diner. The failure of that move would have told him that the situation was no longer contained. It would accelerate his timeline. "We don't have a week," she said. "No. We need to find the original evidence, consolidate it, and get it into the right hands before he decides the diner approach was too subtle." He looked at her. "Where are the physical records?" She hesitated. Not distrust, he thought, but the instinctive caution of someone who'd kept something safe by keeping it completely private. Then she said, "A storage facility in Cartwell, about 40 minutes east, rented under my assistant's name, but she doesn't know what's in it. I want to move them today, somewhere new, somewhere not connected to you or anyone you've used before." He looked around the motel room. "And you need to move too. This location's been stable for 1 night. That's about as long as it stays safe." "I know." She reached for her phone, the new one, a prepaid she'd bought at a gas station, then stopped. Something had shifted in her expression. Not fear, something more complicated. "My assistant called this morning. Elena. She said 2 men came to the Monroe Solutions offices last night after hours. They told the security guard they were auditors from a regulatory board. They wanted access to personnel files." The air in the room got careful. "Personnel files," Ethan said, "including employment records, emergency contacts." She set the phone down. "Elena's listed as my emergency contact at the firm, and the storage unit is in her name." The sequence was clear, and it was bad. Preston didn't know where the physical records were, but he'd found the thread and he was pulling it. He had the assistant's name. From the assistant's name, given enough pressure or enough access to the right databases, he could find the storage unit. From the storage unit, if he got there first, he had everything. "We go now," Ethan said. "Elena, call her. Tell her to take a personal day. Give her a reason that has nothing to do with this. Tell her not to go to the office." He was already moving toward the door. "Can you reach her without using a number Preston's people might have flagged?" Liana picked up the prepaid. "Yes." "Make the call in the truck. Let's go." The drive to Cartwell took 43 minutes on back roads that Ethan chose specifically because they were indirect and not the route a navigation app would suggest. Liana made 2 calls, one to Elena, keeping her voice level, the excuse about a family matter delivered naturally enough that Elena accepted it with mild concern, and no suspicion. The second call was to a man named Warren Chu, who she described only as a former colleague who now worked in digital forensics and owed her a favor. Ethan didn't ask about the favor. He drove and watched the mirrors. The storage facility was a low beige building set back from Route 9E, the kind of anonymous structure that existed in the background of every mid-sized American county without anyone paying it particular attention. 12 rows of orange roll-up doors behind a keypad gate, a small office with a single attendant who was watching something on his phone when they pulled in. The unit was in row 7. Liana used a key she'd kept on a ring with no other identification, opened the door, and they were inside in under 90 seconds. The records were in a fireproof lockbox inside a larger plastic storage container, surrounded by what appeared to be, and probably were, genuine boxes of old business documents. Practical camouflage. The kind of hiding in plain sight that worked because nobody went through other people's storage units box by box without a specific reason to. Ethan lifted the lockbox. It was heavier than it looked. This everything? Everything physical. The digital copies are on 2 encrypted drives, both off-site, different locations. I've been keeping them separated so that no single event could destroy all of it. Smart. He moved toward the door, then stopped. The attendant from his office was walking across the lot toward them. Not aggressively, hands in his pockets, relaxed, but at a pace that was covering ground faster than a man making casual rounds would. Ethan set the lockbox down behind the storage container and stepped partway out of the unit, positioning himself between Liana and the approaching man. "Help you?" Ethan said. The attendant stopped about 15 feet out. He was mid-30s, unremarkable, wearing the facility's polo shirt. He looked at Ethan, then past him at Liana, then back to Ethan. "Just checking in," he said. "We had a couple guys here earlier asking about this unit. Said they were with a regulatory board, needed access for an audit." He paused. "I told them they'd need the account holder or a court order. They left." Another pause, weighted differently. "I figured if you were coming in today, you might want to know that." Ethan studied him for a moment. "You didn't call the account holder?" "I tried. Went to voicemail." He shrugged, the shrug of a man who took his job as seriously as the job warranted, and apparently slightly more. "The two guys, one of them had a watch that cost more than this building's monthly revenue. I've been doing this work 6 years. Regulatory auditors don't wear watches like that." From behind Ethan, Liana spoke. "Thank you for telling us." The attendant nodded once, looked at both of them with the particular expression of a person who'd decided something was outside his jurisdiction and was at peace with that decision, and walked back toward the office. They were at the truck in 4 minutes with the lockbox secured in the bed under a tarp. Ethan pulled out of the lot and drove east, away from the direct route back, putting 2 miles between them and the facility before he said anything. "They were already there," Liana said. "Few hours ahead of us." He checked the mirror. Clear. "He's moving faster than I expected. He knows we're consolidating, he knows the diner failed, and now we're trying to get the evidence somewhere safe." She had the legal pad on her knee and was writing something. "Which means he's done being cautious." Ethan drove and thought about that. Preston Crowe had spent months building something methodical. The shell companies, the compromised officials, the slow systematic bleeding of the organization. That kind of personality didn't abandon method without significant pressure. The fact that he was sending people to storage facilities with cover stories about regulatory audits, moving in daylight, accepting the risk of being noticed. That said, he'd calculated that the risk of waiting was now higher than the risk of moving openly. Something had changed in his timeline, and Ethan didn't yet know what. He found out at 2:17 that afternoon when Garrett called. "There's a video," Garrett said without preamble. Ethan was parked in the lot of a diner outside Cartwell, different from Bellwether in every way except that it also smelled like bacon grease. Liana was inside, in a booth near the back, eating something she'd barely touched. He'd come outside to take the call. "What kind of video?" Ethan said, though something in his gut had already assembled the answer before Garrett spoke it. "Security footage from the diner." Or something being presented as security footage from the diner. Garrett's voice was measured, the voice of a man delivering bad news with clinical precision because that was more useful than any other register. "It's been edited, not obviously, professionally. It shows you arriving at Bellwether before the shooting, making contact with a woman matching Liana Monroe's description, and a sequence that's been cut and resequenced to suggest that you and she were coordinating before the attack rather than during it. The timestamps are manipulated, but they're manipulated well enough that a casual viewer wouldn't catch it. Ethan was very still. Where is it? 3 local news stations picked it up this morning, 1 regional outlet. It's been attributed to an anonymous tip to law enforcement, which means it's going to get traction before anyone stops to verify the original footage. A pause. Maddox, they're running your name and your face. A former Greyhaven resident is already being quoted saying you were always a strange one who kept to himself. The way people always describe the man they hadn't paid enough attention to until they needed to explain something. How long until the police want me in for questioning? You've probably got until end of day. Maybe less if the story gets picked up wider. Garrett paused. There's a Detective Briggs who seems like he's going to push back on the narrative. He interviewed you. I assume he's got instincts about it. But instincts don't hold against video, and video is what the media has right now. Can you access the original facility footage? Bellwether would have had exterior cameras, probably interior. Already looking. The facility system was wiped remotely sometime this morning. Professional work. They got into the system and removed the originals before the edited version went out, which means this was prepared in advance. They had the edit ready to go, and they were waiting for the right moment to release it. Ethan absorbed that. The attack on the diner had failed. Preston had released the video as the contingency, not to prove anything, but to change the terrain, to turn Ethan from an inconvenient protector into a named suspect before he could get the evidence to anyone who could act on it. To make sure that if Ethan walked into a federal building with a lockbox full of documents, the first question any official would ask was whether this was the man currently being named in connection with the shooting. It was clean. He had to give Preston that much. It was a clean move. Garrett, I need that original footage. I know you do. I'm working on it. But Ethan, a beat. The first time in the conversation, he dropped the clinical register. I can get you a channel to the right people if you have the evidence. I can work the angle on the footage, but I need time. And if you get picked up for questioning, time is the one thing we lose. I understand. Do you have somewhere to be that's not on anyone's radar? He thought for a moment. Yeah, I do. Good, stay there. Don't use your regular phone after this call. I'll use the number you have for me to reach your new device. The call ended. Ethan sat in the truck for a moment looking at the diner window, where he could see Liana's silhouette in the booth. She was on the phone, the prepaid, and even through the glass he could read the tension in her posture. She'd seen it already, or someone had just told her. He went inside. She looked up when he slid into the booth. The phone was face down on the table. Her food was still untouched. I just saw the video, she said. I know. Ethan. She said his name with the particular weight of someone who just realized that the thing they'd tried to keep from touching another person had touched him thoroughly. I'm sorry, this is... Don't. Not harshly. This isn't something you did. This is Preston responding to a problem, and I'm the problem he's trying to neutralize. That's not on you. He looked at her. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it straight. Okay? Your father. Is there any version of this where he and Preston are still working together? Where the convoy at the diner was theater, letting you think he'd turned on Preston, making me comfortable enough to work with you? She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze and didn't apologize for the question because it was the question that needed asking, and she seemed to understand that. No, she said, there isn't. My father has many things wrong with him. Dishonesty with people he considers family isn't one of them. She paused. I know that's a complicated thing to say about a man who built what he built, but I know him. If he said Preston moved against me, Preston moved against him too, and my father doesn't forgive that. Which means Silas is also a target. Yes, which means Preston needs to move fast because my father has resources, and when he understands the full scope of what Preston has done, he'll use all of them. Ethan thought about the sequence. Preston had tried to eliminate Liana. Quietly, deniably. It had failed. He'd released the video, changing the narrative, buying time, keeping Ethan off the board. The next move would be against Silas, before Silas could fully mobilize. And then, with Silas neutralized and the evidence buried and Ethan's credibility destroyed, Preston would have the clean exit he'd been engineering for months. "We need to move the lockbox again," Ethan said, "and I need to make a copy of everything in it, not for safekeeping, for delivery. Garrett has a channel, but we need to be ready to hand it over the moment that channel is confirmed." "I can get the digital drives. One's in Ashford, a safety deposit box. The other's with someone I trust absolutely." She paused. "My father's former driver. He's been out of the organization for 5 years. He's clean, and he knows how to keep something safe." "Does Preston know about him?" She considered that carefully. "He knows his name. I don't think he'd connect him to me directly. We've been deliberately disconnected." Deliberately is only as good as the person who did the disconnecting. "It was me, and I was careful." He looked at her. "Okay." He meant it. They were careful for the rest of that day and the next. Careful in the way that was second nature to him and that Liana adapted to with an ease that impressed him, even as the news cycle kept cycling and his face kept appearing in graphics that said "person of interest" in the bold, definitive font that television used when it wanted to be accurate but also dramatic. Sophie called him on the new number. He hadn't given it to her. She'd gotten it from Danny, who'd gotten it from Ethan with instructions to pass it only if necessary. Apparently 13-year-old girls and their ideas of necessity were broader than he'd specified. "I saw the news," she said. "I know. They're saying you were involved in the shooting." "I know what they're saying." "Dad." Her voice was careful. Not the 13-year-old careful. The other kind. The kind that had learned his silences and knew how to read around them. "Are you okay?" "I'm working on it." "That means no." "It means I'm working on it." He paused. "Sophie, I need you to stay at Carla's. Not because you're in danger right now, but because I need to know exactly where you are and that you're safe. And if you're at Carla's, I know both of those things." "And where are you?" "Somewhere safe. Being careful." A long pause on her end. He could hear her breathing, could picture her sitting on Carla's guest bed, probably cross-legged, phone in both hands the way she always held it when she was thinking about something she didn't want to say wrong. "The woman from the diner," Sophie said. "Liana." "Yes." "Are you helping her?" "Yes." "Good." Said simply, without qualification, and he felt something move in his chest that he didn't have a word for. The specific ache of raising someone to be better than you feared the world would let them be, and watching them be it. "I'll call you tonight," he said. "You better." He pocketed the phone and found Liana watching him from across the small room they'd moved to. A rented room above a mechanic's garage in Cartwell, belonging to a man named Pete Okafor, who'd worked a short contract alongside Ethan's old team a long time ago, and had never asked questions he didn't need answered. Pete had looked at them both, looked at the news on the television in his kitchen, and said, "Back room's yours as long as you need." And that had been the entire conversation. "She sounds like a good kid," Liana said. "She is." He sat down. "Better than I deserve most days." "Don't do that." He looked at her. "The self-deprecation thing. You do it when you're uncomfortable with something going right." She was looking at the documents again, not at him. "I've noticed." He wasn't sure whether to be annoyed or something else. He settled on neither. "Go back to the documents." "I'm always on the documents." But she almost smiled. It was the first thing close to a smile he'd seen from her, and it sat oddly with the exhaustion in the rest of her face, like a light on in one window of an otherwise dark building. They worked through the evening, organizing the evidence into a format that could be transmitted securely and also understood clearly by someone encountering it for the first time. Garrett called at 9 with a confirmation. He had a contact at the federal level who was clean, who had the authority to act on what they had, and who was willing to receive it through an indirect channel that kept Garrett's name out of the formal record. "How long for delivery?" Ethan asked. "I need the package by tomorrow night. If I have it by then, my contact can move inside 48 hours. "We'll have it." He ended the call. Looked at Liana. "Tomorrow night," he said. She nodded. "I'll get the drives in the morning, both of them." She was quiet for a moment. "And then?" "Then we hand it off and let the system do what it's supposed to do." "And if Preston moves before the system gets there?" It was the right question. It was the question he'd been working around all day, because the honest answer was that they had tomorrow to get this done, and Preston Crow was not a man who'd been outmaneuvered without noticing. "Then we deal with that when it happens," he said. He didn't say it casually. He said it the way you state a fact about weather. It might come, and if it does, you manage it, and saying anything more elaborate doesn't change the weather. Liana looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the window. "My father reached out," she said, "while you were on the phone. He wants to meet." Ethan absorbed this. "Did you respond?" "Not yet." She turned back from the window. "He said he has information about Preston's next move. He said it's not what we're expecting." A pause. "He sounded afraid, Ethan. My father doesn't sound afraid." The room held that for a moment. Ethan thought about Silas Vane, the man he'd seen for 3 minutes on a Greyhaven street, 60-something, dark coat, the particular gravity of a man accustomed to being the most dangerous presence in any room. He thought about what it would take to put fear in that voice. "Then we meet him," Ethan said. "I haven't agreed to it yet." "I know." He looked at her. "But you're going to." She held his gaze. He waited for her to push back on that, but she didn't, because she knew it was true, and she was not a person who wasted energy denying things that were true. "Tomorrow morning," she said. He gave a location, a warehouse on the south end of Cartwell that he owns through a holding company. "I'll want to check the location tonight." "I expected that." "And I want to hear what he says before you agree to anything he asks." "So do I." She closed the document folder. "He's my father. That doesn't mean I trust him completely. It means I know how he operates, and right now that knowledge is more useful than anything else." She looked tired in a way that had moved past the physical into something deeper, the tiredness of a person who'd been carrying something they never should have had to carry for too long, without help. "He was going to let me go, years ago. He could have tried to pull me back into the organization. He didn't. Whatever else he is, he let me build something of my own." Ethan didn't say anything. It wasn't the moment for it. "I'm not defending him," she said. "I know. I'm just explaining why I'm willing to sit in a room with him. You don't have to explain it to me." He stood. "People are complicated. Families more than most. I spent 9 years trying to be simple, and here I am, so." She looked at him, and this time it wasn't almost a smile. It was a real one, brief and tired and genuine, the kind that cost something. "So," she agreed. Outside Pete Okafor's garage, the night was quiet and the town was dark, and somewhere across the county a man named Preston Crow was calculating his next move with the focused patience of someone who believed he'd already won the important battles. He hadn't, but he didn't know that yet. And in Ethan's experience, the most dangerous moment in any engagement wasn't when the enemy was strong. It was when they were almost certain they were finished, and something reminded them they weren't. Tomorrow was going to be that something. Ethan drove the warehouse location at 11:30 the night before, alone, with the headlights off for the final 2 blocks. It was a low industrial building on the south end of Cartwell, the kind that had probably processed grain or auto parts or something similarly unglamorous for 40 years before the economics of whatever it did stopped making sense. Corrugated metal walls, a loading dock on the east side, 3 entry points that he could identify from the exterior, the main roll door, a personnel door on the north face, and a roof access ladder on the west end that someone had padlocked, but not seriously. He didn't go inside. He circled the block twice, noted the sightlines, identified where he'd position someone if he were covering the meeting from the outside, and drove back to Pete's garage with a rough layout in his head that he spent another hour converting into something workable. What he built wasn't a plan in the military sense. It was more like a decision tree. If this, then that, and if that fails, then the other thing, branching out until the branches got too speculative to be useful. He'd learned to stop at the 3rd branch. Past the 3rd branch, you were making plans for situations you couldn't predict, and that kind of planning created the illusion of control without the substance of it. He told Liana what he'd found in the morning, over gas station coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime in the previous administration. She listened, looked at the rough sketch he'd made, and asked 2 specific questions: the location of the loading dock relative to the personnel door, and whether there was exterior lighting on the north face. Both questions were practical, and he answered them without remarking on how practical they were. She'd been running for 4 months. She'd learned things. They went to get the drives first. The safety deposit box in Ashford took 40 minutes round trip. The second drive, the one held by Silas's former driver, a quiet man named Raymond Fitch, who lived in a duplex outside Cartwell with 2 dogs and a vegetable garden that was doing better than Ethan's, took another 20. Raymond handed the drive over without ceremony, looked at Liana with something that might have been protectiveness, and said only, "You be careful, Miss Monroe," before going back inside. By 10:15, they had everything. Both drives, the lockbox from the storage facility, and the organized document package Ethan had prepared for Garrett's contact. Ethan transmitted the digital files through a secure channel Garrett had set up, and Garrett confirmed receipt at 10:42 with a single text. "Got it. Contact is moving. 36 hours. 36 hours was longer than Ethan wanted, but shorter than he feared. He texted back, "Understood." Then he put the phone in his jacket pocket and looked at Liana. "Garrett's contact has what he needs," he said. "Now we go meet your father." Silas Vane was already inside when they arrived. He was standing near the center of the warehouse floor, which was empty except for 3 folding chairs someone had brought in and a portable work light that threw the space into contrast, bright at the center, dark at the edges. He was wearing a different coat than he'd had at the diner. His hands were at his sides. He had 2 men with him positioned near the loading dock, both of whom tracked Ethan from the moment he came through the personnel door. Ethan noted them and kept his expression neutral. "You came," Silas said. He was looking at Liana. "You said you had information." She stopped about 10 feet from him. She didn't move toward the chairs. "What is it?" Silas looked at her for a moment. The look of a man who wanted to say something that wasn't the information and who was disciplined enough to know this wasn't the moment. "Preston took someone last night," he said. "One of my people. A man who'd been with me for 12 years. "Took him," Ethan said. "Leverage." Silas turned his gaze to Ethan, the same careful assessment as the street outside Bellwether. "Preston is aware that I've been trying to locate the scope of what he's done. He's aware that Liana has documentation. Taking one of my people is a message. Stand down or the man doesn't come back." "Has he made contact?" Ethan asked. "Yesterday evening. He wants the records Liana has been holding. He wants them delivered to a location of his choosing by 9 tonight. In exchange, my man comes back unharmed, and Preston." Silas paused in the way of someone whose jaw doesn't cooperate with saying something distasteful. "Preston walks. He keeps what he's taken. He disappears. We call it even." The warehouse was very quiet. "He has to know you won't agree to that," Liana said. "He knows I won't, no. He's not negotiating with me." Silas looked at his daughter, and something moved in his face that had no business being on the face of a man who'd built what he'd built. "He's negotiating with you. He believes you'll push for the settlement. He believes you want the violence to end enough to accept a compromise. He's wrong." "I know." Silas said it simply. "I told him as much. He didn't believe me." Ethan was running the geometry. Preston had taken a hostage. He was using the hostage to try to recover the evidence before Garrett's contact could act on it. If the exchange happened, if the records were handed over, Preston would have everything he needed to close the loop cleanly. The hostage would be leverage that expired on delivery, which meant the hostage's safety after the exchange was not something Ethan would bet on. And the records, once in Preston's hands, would be destroyed. "Where's the exchange location?" Ethan asked. Silas looked at him with the particular attention of a man recalibrating someone upward. "He said he'd send it 2 hours before the deadline, which means we have until 7 tonight to establish a position." Ethan looked around the warehouse briefly, thinking, "Is the man he took someone you can communicate with? Can he get a message out?" "I don't know. Possibly. Why?" "Because if we know the location before Preston sends it, we control the approach. If we're reacting to a location he chooses at the last minute, we're on his terms." He paused. "Preston has planned this carefully. The edited video, the evidence hunt, the hostage, these aren't improvised. He's been running contingencies, which means the exchange location will be somewhere he's already prepared." Liana was looking at him. An abandoned theater, she said quietly. Both men looked at her. He has one. My father's organization acquired it years ago. A decommissioned theater on the north side of Ashford. It was going to be renovated. The project fell through. She was looking at Silas. Preston managed that acquisition. He knows the building. He knows every way in and out. Silas was very still. I hadn't connected that. I had. I looked at every property with a connection to the organization when I was going through the accountant's records. The theater came up as an asset that had been partially liquidated. Preston moved some of the renovation funds into one of his shell companies. She paused. And it's isolated enough that whatever happens inside it wouldn't be immediately visible from the street. Ethan was already restructuring the decision tree. A theater had specific geometry and a stage, a house, backstage space, loading access in the rear, typically a basement mechanical space. It was the kind of building that rewarded whoever had mapped it first and punished whoever came in reacting. Preston had mapped it, but Ethan had tonight. Mess. He went to the theater at 2 in the afternoon, alone, on foot from a parking position 4 blocks away. He spent an hour and 40 minutes inside, not rushing, not guessing, moving through every accessible space with the methodical patience that was the part of his training most people didn't think about when they thought about what his training had involved. The dramatic parts were the ones that made the story. The useful part was the patience. What he found was a building in mid-state deterioration, not collapsed, not dangerous, but soft at the edges in the way of structures that had been closed and heated intermittently for 15 years. The stage was intact. The house seating was mostly still in place, though several rows had been removed near the center, creating an open floor area. There was a balcony level accessible by 2 stairwells, 1 stage left, 1 stage right. The basement had a mechanical room and a secondary storage area with a ground-level window that had been secured from the outside with a hasp and padlock that was significantly less impressive than whoever had installed it believed. He also found something he hadn't expected. In the basement storage room, stacked against the far wall in a way that looked haphazard but wasn't, were 23 bricks of what he recognized as commercial demolition explosive, older material, the kind that had been used in controlled demolition work and was no longer standard but was absolutely still functional. They were wired to a central line that ran up through the floor into the mechanical room, where it connected to a timer device that was not currently active. He crouched beside the device for a long moment, not touching it. Preston had not been planning an exchange. He'd been planning a conclusion. The exchange was theater, a reason to get Liana and whatever witnesses she brought into the building at a specific time, after which Preston would have the records, would eliminate the witnesses, and would have an explosion that a fire investigator might eventually attribute to old electrical systems in a long-neglected building. Clean. Awful. Clean. Ethan took photographs with the prepaid phone, memorized the central line routing, identified the junction points, and left the building exactly the way he'd entered it. He called Garrett from the truck. "There's a bomb," he said. A pause. Location? Ashford. The Meridian Theater on North Calhoun, basement, commercial demo material, timer device, not currently active. I need your federal contact to have a disposal team on standby, and I need them positioned before 9 tonight without any visible law enforcement presence within 2 blocks of the building. Ethan. I know what I'm asking. Do you? I need the approach clean until the exchange attempt happens. If Preston sees law enforcement before he shows, he burns everything and the hostage dies and the evidence dies with it. He paused. Your contact has what he needs to act on the records. The enforcement action is already justified. I'm asking for 6 hours of patience and a team on standby. Another pause. Longer. I'll make the call, Garrett said. But Maddox, you understand that if this goes sideways inside that building, then that's on me, not on you, not on your contact. That's not what I was going to say. A beat. I was going to say be careful, because I don't have many people left from the old days, and I'd like to keep the ones I have. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I'll be careful. He drove back to Cartwell and told Liana and Silas what he'd found. The silence that followed was the particular silence of people confronting the distance between what they'd understood a situation to be, and what it actually was. Liana sat with it the way she sat with most things. Still, jaw set, working through the implications in order. Silas stood near the work light with his hands clasped behind his back and his face doing something that was probably the closest it got to showing what he was actually feeling. He was never going to let anyone walk out, Silas said. Not a question. No, Ethan said. My man is most likely already in the building, used to draw us in and then dispensable. Ethan paused. Which means we're getting him out regardless. Silas looked at him. Something in the look was complicated in a way that the man clearly didn't have much practice showing. Why? He said, genuinely asking. You don't know him. He's not your concern. He's a person in a building with a bomb, Ethan said. That makes him my concern. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once, slowly, the nod of a man who was updating his understanding of something and doing it honestly. Liana was looking at Ethan. The exchange, she said. Preston is expecting delivery of the records. He'll need to believe the exchange is happening. Yes. Which means someone needs to walk in there with something that looks like the evidence. Yes. I'll do it, she said. I know. He'd known she was going to say it before she said it, in the same way he'd known she would agree to meet her father. Because she was not a person who put other people in front of danger, she could stand in front of herself. He understood that quality because he shared it and because it had cost him things, and he suspected it had cost her things too. But you go in with a copy of the document cover pages and empty drives. The real material is already with Garrett's contact. Preston can't know that until it's too late for it to matter. And you? I'll be inside before you arrive. He paused. There's a second entrance through the basement window on the alley side. I'll have the explosive line disconnected before the exchange starts, and I'll find where they're holding the hostage. Alone, she said. It's better with one person, quieter. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Not doubt, exactly. More like the look of someone who'd learned that arguing with a certain kind of certainty was a waste of energy better spent elsewhere. What about my father? They both looked at Silas. The older man straightened slightly. I'll be outside the building with my people. When you signal? I'll signal when the explosive is disabled and the hostage is located, Ethan said. Not before. Your people come in on my signal, not on a timeline, not on what sounds right from outside. He held Silas's gaze. I need that to be clear. Silas Vane was not a man accustomed to being given clear terms by anyone. He looked at Ethan for a long moment with those deep-lined eyes that had seen a great deal and processed most of it into a kind of resigned authority. Then he said, Clear-ish. They entered separately. Ethan went in at 7:40 through the basement window, 3 inches of clearance on each side, dropping into the storage room quietly enough that the only sound was his own breathing and the distant settling of the building. He stood still for 30 seconds and listened. The building had the particular held breath quality of a space that had people in it somewhere and was trying not to advertise the fact. He moved to the explosive assembly first. The central line ran from the timer device up through a conduit chase in the north wall. He traced it by touch in the near dark, found the junction where it split into 4 branches, and disconnected the primary feed at the junction with a slowness that was not about fear, but about respect for the fact that old commercial explosive material had variables that newer systems didn't. When the connection separated, nothing happened. That was the expected outcome. He allowed himself to exhale. The secondary storage room had a door that opened into the mechanical space. He eased through it and stopped. Silas's man was in the mechanical room. His name, Ethan would learn later, was Marcus, mid-40s, former military by the look of his posture, even restrained, zip-tied to a support column with his wrists behind him and a piece of duct tape across his mouth. He was conscious. When he saw Ethan, he went very still in the careful way of someone who understood that reacting loudly to an unexpected arrival in his situation would be the wrong move. Ethan crossed to him, put a finger to his lips, and cut the zip ties with the folding knife he'd carried since a hardware store run that afternoon. He peeled the tape carefully. Marcus worked his wrists, grimaced, and looked at Ethan with the evaluating look of someone who'd been in bad situations and was taking the measure of the person who'd arrived in this one. "You're with Silas?" Marcus said, barely a breath. "No," Ethan said, equally quiet. "But he's outside. You need to stay in this room until I signal." Marcus looked like he wanted to say something about that. Then he looked at Ethan's face and made the same calculation that most people made when they looked at Ethan's face and heard him say things in a certain way. "Okay," he said. "There are stairs to the main level on the north side of this room. Stay away from them. The window on the east wall. If you hear an explosion or shooting, go out that window and get clear. Don't wait for me." Marcus nodded. Ethan went up the stairs. The theater's main level was dim and vast and smelled of old upholstery and damp. The stage lights weren't on, but someone had positioned 4 industrial work lights at the corners of the open floor area in front of the stage, creating a lit space that was, deliberately, he understood, the only naturally visible area in the building. Everything beyond those lights was dark, the kind of dark that hid things. He moved backstage through a passage he'd mapped that afternoon and found a position in the left wing with a partial sightline to the lit floor. He was there at 8:13. Liana was due at 9. At 8:40, Preston Crowe arrived. He came in through the main entrance. 2 men first, then Preston, then 2 more men behind him, all 4 of the outer men with the practiced nonchalance of people who were armed and weren't bothering to hide it. Preston himself was dressed as Ethan had imagined he'd be dressed. Not threatening, not operationally. A dark jacket, no tie. The clothes of a man who'd convinced himself the hard part was already handled. He was shorter than Ethan expected. Wiry, with the concentrated energy of a man who'd spent decades converting anxiety into action. He walked to the center of the lit area and stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked around the building with a proprietary satisfaction that said he'd stood here before and liked what it represented. His 4 men positioned themselves, 2 near the main entrance, 2 along the side walls. Ethan clocked all of them without moving. At 9:03, Liana came in. She was alone, which was what they'd agreed, and she carried a document bag that looked right. The right size, the right weight, the right level of care in how she held it. She walked into the lit area and stopped 20 feet from Preston. They looked at each other across the lit floor for a moment. Something passed between them that Ethan couldn't quite read from 40 feet away in the dark. Something old and specific to the history between them. "Liana," Preston said, "I wasn't sure you'd come." "You have someone who doesn't belong to this situation," she said. "I come for people who don't belong in things they got dragged into." Something in the way she said it made Ethan think she wasn't just talking about Marcus. "Where's your father?" Preston asked. "Outside with his people." She held up the document bag. "He agreed not to come in. The agreement was records for Marcus. Simple." "Nothing about this is simple." Preston looked at the bag, put it on the floor, and stepped back. She didn't move immediately. "I want to see Marcus first." "Marcus isn't your concern." "He is right now." Her voice was steady. Ethan, watching from the wing, felt something he would have a hard time naming afterward, a kind of recognition, watching someone hold their ground in a situation designed to make holding ground impossible. "Show me Marcus," and I put the bag down. Preston looked at her with the look of a man making a cost calculation. Then he gestured to one of the men near the wall. The man pulled out a phone and made a call. 40 seconds later, the phone in Ethan's jacket pocket vibrated once. Liana's prepaid, sending the prearranged signal. Marcus was confirmed present and alive. He started moving. He came out of the wing on the far side of the stage, away from the light, using the darkness the way he'd spent years learning to use it, not as cover from specific threats, but as an element, something you moved through rather than hid behind. He crossed backstage to the north side of the house and came down a side aisle with the seats on his left and the wall on his right, working toward the nearest of Preston's men. He didn't want to fight 4 armed people in an enclosed space. That was a losing proposition regardless of how good you were, and Ethan had enough honest self-assessment to know that good had limits. What he wanted was the east side of the room clear before Preston's attention shifted. He got close enough to the man near the east wall and put him down without a sound, forearm across the throat, weight redistributed, the man's own panic doing most of the work. He went down slowly and didn't make the crash Ethan was braced for. He flex-cuffed him to a seat armrest with a zip tie from his jacket and moved along the wall toward the second man. On the floor, Preston was talking. He'd accepted Liana's answer about Marcus being confirmed alive, and he was gesturing for her to set the bag down again. She was stalling, asking about the timer, about the conditions, about what happened after the exchange. She was buying exactly the time they'd discussed, and she was good at it, and Ethan understood that the composure he'd seen in her from the first moment in the diner wasn't something she performed. It was something she'd built. The second man near the north entrance presented a different problem. He was facing out toward the building's main door, which meant his peripheral vision covered the house. Ethan stopped in the shadow of the last row and waited. Liana asked about the building's condition, whether it was safe, whether there was structural damage. It was a pointed question if you knew what she was referencing, and Preston didn't. "It's fine," Preston said. "I've had people through it recently." "Good," she said. And then she looked. Just for a fraction of a second, she looked in the direction of the wing where Ethan had been positioned, and she moved the document bag to her left hand. That was the signal. The second man turned toward the sound Ethan created deliberately. A single footstep, half a second of controlled noise. And when he turned, Ethan was already inside his guard. The man was bigger than the first, but the fundamentals didn't change with size. It was loud enough to make Preston look. "What?" Ethan stepped into the light. Preston saw him, and the transformation was immediate. The composed face cracked for just a moment, a split second of raw recalculation, before it sealed back up into something harder and older. "The mechanic," Preston said. The word was contemptuous, a placeholder insult while he sorted what this meant for his planning. "You wired the building," Ethan said. He was watching the two remaining men near the main door. Basement. Commercial demo material on a timer. Something shifted in Preston's expression. I disconnected the primary feed at 7:50 this evening." Ethan kept his voice level. "Your contingency is gone, the exchange is gone, and Garrett's federal contact has had the complete documentation for 11 hours. The room held that. Preston Crow was 61 years old and had spent 2 decades building something from inside another man's organization, slowly, patiently, the way a termite builds in a wall, invisible until the wall fails. He was not a man who showed panic, but what moved through him now was something adjacent to it, something he was suppressing hard. "You don't have the authority to make that kind of move," he said. "I'm a mechanic from Greyhaven," Ethan said. "I don't have authority over anything. I just have the evidence and people who know what to do with it." Preston's hand moved, reaching toward his jacket, not slow about it. Ethan was faster. He crossed the 8 feet between them in the time it took Preston to make a decision, and Preston's wrist was in his grip before the hand completed its path, and he held it there with the kind of pressure that made the decision about trying to continue very clear. From the main entrance, Silas Vane walked in. He hadn't waited for the signal. He had, Ethan would concede later, waited until the moment he could come in without making things worse, which wasn't quite the same agreement they'd made, but was close enough. He walked into the light with 2 men behind him and stopped, and he looked at Preston Crow with 20 years of partnership and betrayal and everything that accrued between 2 people who'd built something together and had irreconcilably different ideas about what it was for. Preston looked at Silas. His jaw worked. "Silas, you need to think about what you're doing here." "I've been thinking," Silas said. "I've had several days." He reached into his jacket. Slowly, the deliberate slowness of a man making sure nobody misread the motion, and produced a phone. He looked at it. "Marcus is out of the building. My men have him." He put the phone away. "It's done, Preston. This is—" Preston stopped. The composure was still there, but there was nothing underneath it anymore. It was a shell. "You don't understand what I've been trying to—" "You stole from me," Silas said, quietly. Not the anger Ethan expected. Something flatter and sadder, and in some ways worse. "You moved against my daughter. You took a man who'd been with me 12 years and used him as a piece on a board. A pause. I trained you. I trusted you. I thought... He stopped. Then, even quieter, I thought you understood what this was supposed to be. What it was supposed to be, Preston's voice came out sharp. You were a criminal, Silas. You built a criminal empire. I adapted to that. I made it work. And when I decided to build something of my own, by destroying everyone else, by taking what I was owed. The two men looked at each other across the lit floor. Liana moved to stand near Ethan. He released Preston's wrist, keeping himself positioned between them. Dad, Liana said. Silas looked at her. The hardness in his face, the thing that had probably been there so long he didn't know how to access what was underneath it, shifted in a way that was almost uncomfortable to watch, like watching something that shouldn't move try to. I want to do something to him, Silas said. I want to, He stopped. I know, she said. Don't. He was going to kill you. I know. She held his gaze. He's going to prison. That's longer than anything else you could give him. Let it be that. Silas stood very still. He looked at Preston. The look of a man deciding something. Probably something he'd been deciding for the last several days. Probably something that was costing him more than he expected it to. Then he looked back at his daughter. All right, he said. It was 2 words. They carried a great deal. Preston had gone very still in the way of someone whose options had sequentially closed and who was doing the math on what remained. His remaining men near the door had read the room and made the sensible decision not to escalate. Silas's people were moving into position. Preston turned to Ethan. Some of the composure had come back. Not the arrogance, but the control. The thing underneath that had let him do what he'd done for as long as he'd done it. You know, I had your service record pulled, he said, years ago. That committee review that ended your SEAL career, that's the one that made it easier to step away. Ethan looked at him. That was me, Preston said. Your debrief on the Markov operation, the discrepancies in the chain of command. I had contacts in the review board. It was useful to have a loose end tied up. He was watching Ethan's face. You never knew. Ethan absorbed it. The committee review, 3 years after the operation in question, 2 years before he'd had Sophie and made the final decision to leave, had been one of the reasons the leaving had felt necessary rather than just chosen. The sense that the institution he'd served had looked at him and found something questionable. He'd spent a long time making peace with it. I know now, he said. Doesn't that... Preston seemed to be looking for something, a reaction, rage or grief, or the desire for something that only Preston could provide. Doesn't that matter to you? Ethan thought about it. The honest answer was that it mattered in the way things mattered when they confirmed what you'd sensed but couldn't prove. Not new pain, just old pain with a name attached. He thought about Sophie, asleep at Carla's house, 3 miles from here, waiting for a call. It matters, he said. It doesn't change anything. Preston looked at him. Then he looked down at the floor. Something in his posture shifted. Not surrender, exactly. More like the particular deflation of a man who'd believed his moves had more power than they turned out to have. I want my lawyer, he said. That seems right, Ethan said. He stepped back and took out his phone and called Garrett, and while the phone was ringing, he looked across the lit floor at Liana Monroe, who was standing near her father with her arms at her sides and her jaw set, and her eyes bright with the effort of holding herself together in a room that had just asked more of her than any room had a right to. She met his gaze. He gave her a small nod. She gave him one back. Outside, the first police sirens were audible in the distance. Real ones this time, moving toward a building where the people who needed to be held were ready to be held, and the evidence that would hold them was already in the hands of someone with the authority to use it. Garrett answered on the 3rd ring. Tell your contact the building is secure, Ethan said. A pause. Then, good man, Maddox. He pocketed the phone. The theater's work lights buzzed steadily above the empty house, and the old building settled around them with the particular indifference of a structure that had seen 100 years of human drama and had learned not to editorialize. And Ethan Maddox stood in the middle of it and waited for the sirens to arrive, tired in every direction and more finished with violence than he had ever been in his life. The arrests happened quietly, the way the most significant things often do. Preston Crowe was taken into federal custody at 11:17 on a Thursday night, walked out of the Meridian Theater in handcuffs by two agents who'd been waiting in an unmarked vehicle 2 blocks north since 8 o'clock. The two men who'd been with him inside the theater were processed separately. The others, the ones positioned outside, the ones who'd driven the vehicles, were picked up in coordinated stops across Ashford County over the following 90 minutes, the kind of operation that had clearly been staged and ready, waiting only for the signal to move. Detective Briggs from Greyhaven PD showed up at the theater at midnight, technically outside his jurisdiction, technically there because Garrett had made a call to someone who'd made a call to someone, and stood in the parking lot talking to the federal agents with the expression of a man who'd spent 3 days defending his instincts about a person of interest and had just been proven right in the most inconvenient way possible. He found Ethan sitting on the hood of his truck in the lot, drinking water from a bottle he'd had in the cab, watching the organized movement of law enforcement with the detached attention of someone who had no more decisions to make tonight. Briggs leaned against the truck beside him without being invited. They sat like that for a moment. "You want to tell me what actually happened?" Briggs said. "I told you what happened. I was at the diner for lunch." "Maddox." Ethan looked at him. "What I told you at the station was true. I was there. I helped people get down. I assisted a woman out the side exit. Everything that came after that was a consequence of those things." Briggs was quiet for a moment. "The video. Fabricated. Garrett's contact has the forensic analysis. It'll be part of the federal record." "Your name's been on the news for 3 days." "I know. That's going to take some unwinding." "Yes," Ethan agreed. "It will." Briggs looked at the theater entrance, where agents were still moving in and out with the deliberate efficiency of people working a scene. The explosive material in the basement. Disconnected before anyone came in. The disposal team has it. "You disconnected it." "Yes." Another long silence. Briggs had the manner of a man who'd gotten where he was by being more patient than the situations he dealt with, and he brought all of that patience to bear now. "You're going to come in and give a full statement," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Tomorrow morning," Ethan said. "First thing." "Not tonight?" "Tonight I need to go tell my daughter I'm alive." He paused. "She's been waiting." Briggs looked at him for another moment. Then he straightened up from the truck and put his hands in his pockets. "Tomorrow," he said. 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock, Ethan said. Briggs walked back toward the building. He stopped once and turned around. "For what it's worth," he said, "I didn't think you were in on it, even with the video." Ethan nodded. "I just needed to know what you actually were," Briggs said. "I'm a mechanic," Ethan said. Briggs made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something more complicated, and went inside. He found Liana in the theater's side parking area, standing apart from the law enforcement activity, her arms crossed against the October air that had gotten genuinely cold while they were inside. She was on the phone, the prepaid, and she ended the call when she heard him approach and turned around. "Elena," she said, "I told her to go back to the office tomorrow, that everything was fine." "Is it?" She considered that with the seriousness it deserved. "The offices are fine, the business is fine. Elena's fine." She paused. "The rest is going to take a while to figure out." He stood beside her. In the parking area, one of the federal vehicles was pulling out, headlights sweeping across the old theater facade. The marquee letters long since removed, the facade peeling in long strips, the whole structure looking exactly like what it was. A place where something had happened once, and where something else had just ended. "My father's being processed," Liana said. "He turned himself in to the federal agents on site. His attorneys are already involved." She said it in the careful voice she used when she was talking about something that had emotional weight she wasn't ready to fully look at. "He's cooperating. He told them he would provide full information about the organization's operations in exchange for consideration at sentencing. That's significant. It's everything, actually. Most of what the organization did, the legitimate parts and the other parts. It needs his cooperation to fully unravel. She paused. He asked me to be there. At the processing, I told him I couldn't tonight. Okay. I didn't say I wouldn't be there eventually. She looked at the theater facade. I don't know what that looks like yet. He's my father, and he did things I can't make not true by forgiving them. And he also drove 12 vehicles to a diner to make sure I wasn't dead. She exhaled slowly. People aren't single things, I know that. It doesn't make it easier. No, Ethan said. It doesn't. They stood in the cold for a moment. Somewhere across the lot, a radio crackled and went quiet. Preston said he manipulated your service review, Liana said. The committee. Your career. He did. Does that... She stopped, started again. How are you with that? He thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. The service review had been the thing that tipped a decision he'd already been making. Out of the Navy, out of the operational life, into the quieter and more manageable world of a man with a baby daughter and a skill set that translated reasonably well into running a garage. He'd spent years believing the review had found something real, some genuine deficiency in his judgment, and had calibrated himself against that belief. It had made him careful. It had made him humble in ways that were probably useful. If the review had been manufactured, then the calibration had been against a fiction. But the carefulness remained. The humility remained. A wrong reason had produced a right result, and he wasn't sure what to do with that except accept it, the way you accept most things that can't be changed, by deciding it doesn't have to define what comes next. I'm going to be okay with it, he said. I'm not all the way there yet, but I'll get there. She looked at him. That's an honest answer. I'm trying to give more of those. Something in her face softened slightly. Not the exhaustion lifting, because that was going to take days, but something underneath the exhaustion that was less guarded than the thing that was usually there. I have to figure out what I'm doing, she said, with everything. Where I'm going, what the company looks like now that this is public, whether Greyhaven is... She stopped. I don't know where I'm going. That's all right. Is it? You've been running for 4 months, he said. You stopped running 2 hours ago. You don't have to know where you're going tonight. She was quiet. Then, where are you going? To tell my daughter I'm alive. Then to sleep for about 11 hours. Then to give a statement to Briggs at 8 in the morning. He paused. Then back to the shop, probably. There's a Mustang restoration that's been waiting on me, and Danny's going to have opinions about that. She almost smiled. The almost smile that was real. The one that cost something. A Mustang restoration. 68. She runs clean now. The owner's going to be very happy. Liana looked at him. In the parking lot light, her face was tired and complicated and more honest than he'd seen it in any of the controlled, careful moments of the last several days. All the composure and the discipline and the calibrated steadiness was still there, but it was tired, and underneath it was just a person who'd been through a great deal and was still standing. Thank you, she said. Not the reflexive kind. The kind that comes from the specific named place in a person where gratitude lives when it's real. For all of it, the diner, the motel, the storage facility, the theater. A pause. For not walking away when you should have. I didn't have a cleaner option, he said. Ethan. You're welcome, he said. Straight. You're welcome. He called Sophie from the truck before he started the engine. She answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been awake, which he'd expected. Dad? I'm okay, he said immediately, because that was the first thing she needed. Everything's done. I'm coming to get you. A pause on her end. He heard her exhale, a long, slow breath, the sound of a person releasing something they'd been holding for hours. Okay, she said. Then, after a moment, are you actually okay, or are you saying that? Both, he said. I'm tired. I'm going to be sore tomorrow, but I'm okay. I promise. Another pause. The news said the video was fabricated. It's been on the updates for the last hour. Yeah. People at school are going to have a lot to say about this. I imagine so. I'm going to need a really good explanation of literally everything, she said. Not the version for other people, the actual version. You'll get it, he said. Tomorrow. Tonight I just want to drive and pick you up and go home. A brief silence, then quieter. I made Aunt Carla's guest room a mess. I had your case files spread all over the floor. He frowned. What case files? The ones I found on your notepad. I photographed them before you left, and I've been trying to figure out the shell company structure. A pause. I think I understand how Preston moved the money through the third-tier entities. I made a diagram. Ethan sat with that for a moment. His 13-year-old daughter had spent the last 3 days building a financial diagram of a money laundering operation. Sophie, I was worried. It's how I deal with being worried. We're going to talk about that. I know. She didn't sound particularly concerned about that conversation. Ethan, she called him by his name when something was serious. She'd started doing it around 11, and he'd never told her to stop because it was serious. Yeah, he said. I'm really glad you're okay. Me too, kid, he said. Me too. Bummt. The formal clearance of his name came 11 days later, in a press statement from the federal prosecutor's office that was thorough and unambiguous and received approximately a third of the media attention that the original fabricated video had. That was how those things worked. The accusation traveled fast and loud, and the correction traveled slower and quieter, and the people who'd heard the first thing and missed the second went on believing what they'd first been told because correcting a belief required more effort than forming one. Detective Briggs held a press availability at the Greyhaven PD and said, on record, that Ethan Maddox had been cooperative with law enforcement throughout, and that the evidence conclusively demonstrated he had acted to protect civilians during the Bellwether Diner incident. Briggs said it in the flat, factual tone of a man who found press availabilities slightly distasteful, but understood their necessity, and when a reporter asked whether the department owed Maddox an apology, Briggs said, "We followed the information we had. When the information changed, our position changed. That's what we're supposed to do," which was not quite an apology, and was probably the most honest thing anyone said about the whole business in a public forum. Danny came in the morning after the press statement and leaned in the office doorway with a coffee and said, "So, you want to talk about it?" "Not really," Ethan said. "Cool," Danny said. "Mustang's owner keeps calling." "I know. Tell him Friday." "Today's Thursday." "Then it'll be ready tomorrow." Danny nodded and turned to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, "the guy from the county assessor's office never came back." "Good. And the 2 cars that were parked outside your house, I know, they moved." "Right." Danny tapped the door frame twice. "Friday, then," and went back to the bay. The shop returned to its ordinary rhythms with a speed that surprised Ethan slightly, and then didn't surprise him because ordinary rhythms were what people wanted from the places they brought their cars and their trust. They didn't want the mechanic to be interesting. Interesting was exhausting. They wanted competent and reliable, and here when you needed it, and Ethan Maddox was all 3 of those things, and had always been. And that didn't change because his face had been on the news. Mrs. Alvarez from 3 blocks over brought in her Civic for an oil change and told him she'd always known the video was nonsense. Mr. Ferreira, who owned the '68 Mustang and collected them with the focused passion of a man whose other passion was golf, and who had long since realized which one he was better at, came on Friday afternoon and stood in the bay for 20 minutes listening to the engine run before he said, "Beautiful, absolutely beautiful," and paid in full, plus a tip that Ethan tried to refuse and Ferreira refused to take back. It was a week before Sophie brought the financial diagram downstairs and showed it to him, and he looked at it for a long time because it was genuinely good. Not because she was his kid and he was inclined to think so, but because the structural logic was sound and the connections she'd identified were real. She'd mapped the shell company layering from the accountant's records he'd written in his notepad, worked out the transfer pattern, and annotated it in a color-coded system that would not have been out of place in a federal prosecution exhibit. "Where did you learn to do this?" he said. "YouTube," she said. "And a library book about forensic accounting that I got out 3 months ago." "Why did you get a forensic accounting book 3 months ago?" She gave him the look. "Because you have a locked storage unit full of things you got from your past life, and because I'm 13 and not stupid, and because I figured if things ever went wrong, I should understand how money moving through fake companies worked. A pause. I was hoping I was being paranoid. He looked at her. His daughter, who had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, and a brain that worked in ways neither of them had adequately planned for. Sophie, he said, I know. We're going to have the full conversation. We are. Can it wait until after dinner? I want tacos. He folded the diagram carefully and put it on the desk. Yeah, he said. It can wait until after dinner. The conversation they had that night was long and honest in the way that conversations between parents and children rarely are, because honesty requires the adult to put down the protective instinct to curate, and curating was something Ethan was good at and had done too much of. He told her about the Navy. Not all of it. Some of it wasn't his to tell, and some of it would remain the kind of thing that lived in its own closed room. But enough. He told her about the operation that had led to the review. He told her what Preston had revealed about the review being manipulated. He told her about the years he'd spent believing it, and the way that belief had shaped the man he'd tried to become. She listened without interrupting, which was not her usual mode. And when he finished, she sat with it for a moment in the way she sat with things she was taking seriously. You're not a different person than you thought you were, she said. What do you mean? You thought the review found something wrong with how you made decisions, like there was a flaw in you that you'd been compensating for. She looked at him directly. But the review was fake. There was no flaw. You were compensating for something that wasn't there. She paused. Which means you're actually just who you are, not a fixed version of a broken thing. He looked at his kid, his daughter who'd been taking forensic accounting books out of the library and diagramming shell company structures because she loved him and was afraid and had decided that preparation was better than helplessness. When did you get this smart? He said. I've always been this smart, she said. You just thought I was younger than I am. That was probably true. He'd been extending the protections of her younger years past the point where she needed them, holding himself between her and things she was already capable of understanding and calling it care when some of it was his own reluctance to let the time pass. I'm sorry, he said, for not telling you more. Don't be sorry for all of it. Some of it you were right to keep. She shrugged, the complicated shrug of someone working out what they actually felt versus what seemed like the right thing to feel. Just going forward, more. Okay? Yeah, he said. More. She seemed satisfied with that. Then, is Liana okay? I think so. She's got a lot to work through. Are you going to see her again? He hadn't answered that question, including to himself. Liana had been in Greyhaven intermittently over the 2 weeks since the theater. There were statements to give, attorneys to deal with, the business of the investigation's practical aftermath that required her presence in the county. They'd had coffee twice. The conversations had been easy, in the way conversations were easy when two people had already seen each other under conditions that removed every layer of social performance and left only the actual person. She was not pretending to be more composed than she felt, which was the thing he'd noticed most. The careful control was still there, but she wasn't leaning on it the way she had been. She was letting herself be tired when she was tired, let herself say things that didn't land perfectly. He liked who she was when she was not performing. He suspected she was beginning to figure that out about herself too. I'm going to see her again, he said. Sophie processed this with a neutrality that was performing very hard at neutrality. Okay, she said. Okay? I mean, yes, obviously. She seems like a real person. She stood up and took her plate to the sink. That's the threshold, by the way. Real person. Noted. And she's going to have to meet me properly. Not the way things were, just passing by in a crisis. Properly. That's fair. She ran water over the plate. And she should know that I'm not going to be weird about it, but I'm also not going to pretend it's nothing. It's something. So, he agreed. She turned off the tap and looked at him from across the kitchen. His daughter, who was going to be fine, who was already fine, who had been fine all along, even when he'd been too deep in the business of protecting her to notice she'd already grown into someone who could handle most of what the world had. Tacos were good, she said. Yeah, he said. They were. Silas Vane entered a cooperation agreement with the federal prosecutor's office in the third week of November. The agreement was extensive: 22 months of documented organizational activity, 14 named individuals, 6 properties, 2 shell company networks, and a financial disclosure that his attorneys described publicly as comprehensive, and that the federal investigators described privately as more useful than anything they'd generated through conventional investigation in the previous 4 years. His sentencing hearing was scheduled for the spring. Liana did not attend the cooperation hearings. She read the public filings and talked to her own attorney and made the decision that her father's legal process was his to navigate and her energy was better directed elsewhere. She was not indifferent to it. She told Ethan once that she checked the case docket every morning, that she couldn't stop herself from looking, that she wasn't sure yet what she wanted the outcome to be beyond the obvious, beyond just and proportionate. He told her that not knowing what you wanted wasn't a failure of feeling. It was just an honest account of a complicated situation. She'd looked at him and said, "You've gotten better at that." At what? Saying things that are true without making them sound like advice. He'd thought about that for a while afterward. Monroe Solutions resumed full operations in early November, a fact that the business press covered with the kind of brief interest reserved for stories that had initially looked like scandals and turned out to be something more complicated. Elena, Liana's assistant, proved to be excellent in a crisis. She'd kept the firm's clients informed, maintained the operational calendar, and managed the internal anxiety with a steadiness that, Liana told Ethan, had made her reevaluate the entire framework by which she'd been compensating her staff. "How so?" he'd asked. "I was paying her for the job she described on paper. I should have been paying her for the job she actually did." She'd said it with the particular rueful acknowledgement of someone recognizing a blind spot. "I'm fixing it." "Good. It's what you do with blind spots. You find them and you fix them." She'd looked at him. "Or you find someone who makes them visible." He hadn't said anything to that. He wasn't always sure what to say when she said things like that, things that had more than one meaning, and that she delivered without pressure, without requiring him to respond to both layers at once. He was learning, slowly, that she wasn't asking him to be ready for what he wasn't ready for. She was just telling him the truth of where she was, and leaving room. That was a thing about her he hadn't expected, the room she left. The Bellwether Diner reopened in December, after repairs that took 6 weeks and produced a new front window that was noticeably better than the one it replaced. The owner, a woman named Pat Curran, who had been running the place for 19 years and had no intention of stopping, put up a small chalkboard sign on the first day back that said, "Welcome back, same pie, better windows." Greyhaven came out for it the way small towns come out for their own. Not with ceremony, just with presence, just with the ordinary act of showing up because something that mattered had been restored. Ethan was there for the reopening. He sat in the same booth, back left, facing the door. He ordered the club sandwich. It was the same as it had always been, which was the point. He was almost through it when Liana sat down across from him. She didn't announce herself. She just slid into the booth and picked up the laminated menu and looked at it and said, "Does the pie hold up to the reputation?" "Depends on the pie," he said. "Cherry." "Then yes." She put the menu down. She was wearing a jacket he hadn't seen before, something practical against the December air, and she looked different than she had every other time he'd seen her. Not less tired exactly, but differently tired. The tiredness of someone working through something rather than the tiredness of someone being worked over by it. "I'm staying in Greyhaven through January," she said. "There are still things to sort out with the federal process, and my attorneys think it's better to stay local." She paused. "Also, I've been looking at a property on the east side of town. The old Bellwether building used to be part of a larger space. There's an adjacent storefront that's been empty for 3 years. He looked at her. "What are you thinking about doing with it?" "Something I can't quite name yet. Something that takes people who've had the wrong kind of opportunities and gives them different ones." She looked at the table. "The accountant who started all this. He's still in the coma. His medical bills are substantial. I've been covering them. But there are other people who got caught in the edges of what my father built. People who didn't choose it and couldn't get out of it. I've been thinking about what that kind of situation needs." She paused. It's not fully formed. It's just a direction. He thought about her sitting in the motel room with the documents organized into 3 stacks, working through the night on something that could have gotten her killed, because she'd decided that the truth mattered more than the safety of doing nothing. He thought about her walking into the Meridian Theater with a bag full of decoy documents and holding her ground in the lit circle, while Preston Crowe tried to make her feel like a piece he could move. She wasn't a piece. She'd never been one. She'd just been in spaces that treated her like one, and she'd spent a long time trying to put enough distance between herself and those spaces. And now she was doing something harder and more deliberate. Not running, but building. Not away from something, but toward it. "The pie's good," he said. "You should try it." She looked at him. "And the location on the east side. There's a contractor I know. Reliable, doesn't overcharge, shows up when he says he will." He paused. "Which is rarer than it sounds." She held his gaze for a moment with those steady, reading eyes. Then she flagged down the server. "Cherry pie," she said. "And coffee, please." The server wrote it down and walked away, and the diner moved around them in its ordinary Tuesday way. Plates clattering, conversations layering over each other, the bell above the door marking arrivals and departures. And Ethan Maddox sat in the back booth of Bellwether Diner in Grey Haven and looked across the table at a woman who had come into his life through a broken window and a decision made in less than a second, and thought that most of the important things happened that way. Not planned, not chosen from a position of comfort and information. Just a moment that arrived and a decision about whether you were going to move or stand still. He'd moved. He was still deciding what that meant. But sitting here, in this particular booth, in this particular town, at this particular table with the window fixed and the coffee bad and the pie worth coming back for, it didn't feel like something that needed resolving. It felt like something that was still happening, like a story that had reached the end of its emergency and was figuring out day by day what came after the emergency. What normal looked like. What ordinary meant when you'd been through the kind of things that changed the meaning of ordinary. Outside the new window, Grey Haven was doing what it always did, being a mid-sized town where nothing interesting ever happened, which was not true, and had never been true, and was the particular myth that a town told itself to avoid thinking too hard about the lives running underneath its surface. He thought about something Sophie had asked him that morning over breakfast, out of nowhere, with the unceremonious directness that was her primary mode. "Do you think most people are good?" He thought about it. He thought about it again now. He didn't think most people were good or bad in the way the question implied, as if the answer were fixed, as if people were finished products rather than ongoing processes. Preston Crowe had built 2 decades of competence and loyalty into a slow betrayal, and the reasons for it were probably more human and more pathetic than his methods suggested. Silas Vane had built something corrupt, and had loved his daughter, and had, at the end, chosen one over the other. Marcus, the hostage who'd been zip-tied to a column in a basement, had spent his time in captivity, Ethan had found out later, memorizing his captors' faces and counting the number of steps between rooms, gathering information even when gathering information had no immediate use, because that was the habit of a man who survived things by refusing to be passive inside them. Good and bad were not the interesting question, he'd decided. The interesting question was what people did with themselves at the moments when it cost something real, when doing right was inconvenient, when looking away was easier and no one would have blamed you for it. He'd walked across a diner toward a bullet because someone was in the way of it, and the fact of the bullet had not changed the calculation in any meaningful sense. Some decisions weren't made by thinking. They were made by who you'd become before the moment arrived. That was what he'd told Sophie. You become something over a long time, and then the moment comes, and you find out what you became. She'd thought about that for a moment, and then said, "What if you don't like what you find out? Then you become something different," he'd said. "That's the other thing people can do." The cherry pie arrived. Liana looked at it, then at him. "You're not going to tell me if it's worth it," she said. "You're going to make me find out." "That's how you know something's actually good," he said. "You try it yourself." She picked up the fork, tried it, looked at the plate for a moment. "Okay," she said. "That's worth it." Outside, a car pulled past on Millbrook. Ordinary, unhurried, someone going somewhere they needed to be. The bell above the door rang as someone came in out of the cold. The server called an order back to the kitchen. Grey Haven, on a Tuesday afternoon in December, being exactly what it was. Ethan Maddox finished his sandwich and thought that sometimes the best thing a person could do with all the damage they'd survived and all the distance they'd tried to put between themselves and the things they'd been through was to sit still for a moment. To let the ordinary be ordinary. To stop bracing for the next thing long enough to notice that the current thing, this table, this coffee, this unremarkable afternoon, was not nothing. It was, in fact, the whole point. It had always been the whole point. He just hadn't been able to see it clearly until he'd had something worth coming back to.